All right, let's deep dive into React.
Ooh, React.
Yeah, you know, that JavaScript library for building user interfaces?
It's everywhere.
It is. It's like, I feel like I'm hearing about it constantly. So
Yeah.
we've got some excerpts here from a beginner's guide to React, and I'm like super curious to unpack this whole thing, especially why it's become, you know, such a big deal.
Well, you know what's really interesting about it is I feel like it tackles a pain point that people have been, developers have been struggling with for years.
Oh, yeah.
Which is like that clunky DOM manipulation.
Oh, you mean like directly updating web pages with just tons of JavaScript?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that always felt really like inelegant to me.
Right.
So is React basically just like a better way to do that?
It's more than just better. It's like a whole different approach.
Okay.
It's instead of telling the browser how to change things step by step,
Right.
it's more like you're describing what you want the final result to look like.
Yeah.
So it's moving more towards like this declarative programming.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but like I need examples
Sure.
because my brain is still stuck in that how world.
So imagine you're building like a product listing page.
Okay.
And instead of writing like lines and lines of code to create each product element and its image and its description and price and so on,
Yeah.
you would just create a reusable component called product.
Hmm.
So then you have this blueprint
Oh, like a blueprint.
that you can stamp out.
And you can just use it over and over again.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's kind of where React's like this component-based architecture really shines.
Right.
You're breaking down your user interface into these independent, like Lego-like pieces.
I like that.
So it makes it so much easier to manage.
Okay, so how do these components then like show up on the page?
So React uses something called JSX,
Okay.
which lets you write like HTML-like structures right within your JavaScript code, which I feel like for a web developer feels very natural.
Yeah.
But under the hood, it's getting translated into like those DOM manipulations.
Clever.
Mm-hmm.
So we're writing in JSX, we're creating these reusable components.
Yes.
But how do we actually make things interactive?
Right.
Like if I have like a button I want it to like do something when I click on it.
That's where we get into the world of state and props.
State and props, I've heard those
Yeah.
like thrown around, but to be honest, they're still a little fuzzy for me.
Okay, so think of it this way.
Okay.
State is the internal data that a component manages.
Okay.
So if you have a counter,
Right.
the current count would be its state.
Gotcha.
And then props are how you pass data between components.
So if I had like a main component that's like fetching all this data about products,
Yeah.
it would pass that data as props to each individual product component to display.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then what's brilliant is when the state of a component changes, React will automatically figure out the most efficient way to update that page.
Nice.
And that's all thanks to this thing called the virtual DOM.
Wait, hold on, back up. Virtual DOM, that sounds kind of like mystical.
I know.
What is that?
It's very, it's actually quite logical.
Okay.
So imagine like a lightweight copy of the actual web page structure
Okay.
living in the computer's memory.
Okay.
So every time you change data, React will update this virtual DOM first,
Okay.
compared to the real one,
Gotcha.
and then only update the parts that actually need changing.
Oh, so that's how it's like more performant.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see that.
Yeah.
But how do we actually make those changes to the virtual DOM? Is that where things get super complex?
Not really, no.
Okay.
So React provides these functions called hooks,
Okay.
which give you all the tools you need to manage state, handle events like clicks, and more. And it's all designed to be very intuitive.
So before we get into those hooks,
Yeah.
let me just like make sure I'm solid on this. So we've got components written in JSX. They pass data around as props. Is that like the essence of React so far?
You got it, yeah.
All right, so I'm ready to go deeper.
Awesome.
Let's talk about those hooks and how they make these components like come to life.
Let's do it.
Let's dive into that next.
Okay.
Okay, so we've kind of got our heads around components and props, like the building blocks of a React app.
Right.
But how do we actually make these components do something?
Right.
You know, react to like user actions, update information on the page, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so that's where That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
And that is where state comes in.
Okay.
So remember how we talked about state being like a component's internal memory?
Yeah, like if we had a counter.
Right.
The current count would be its state.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
So React gives us this really awesome tool called the useState hook.
useState hooks.
To manage that internal state. So it's a way to keep track of data that might change within a component.
Right.
And then tell React, hey, something changed, you need to re-render this.
Okay.
Show the user the latest information.
Gotcha. So let's say I've got like a button.
Yeah.
And that button's supposed to increase the count on our like counter example.
Okay.
How would I use this useState hook to make that happen?
So first you would use useState to initialize that count to 0.
Okay.
Within your component.
Gotcha.
And your state also gives you a function to update that count.
Okay.
So when the button is clicked,
Yeah.
you'd call that update function, pass in the new count, and boom, React takes care of the rest.
So I don't have to like manually tell React, hey, re-render this component with the new count.
No.
It just like knows to do that.
It just knows to do that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it.
That's pretty cool.
You just focus on managing that data, and React handles all those DOM manipulations behind the scenes.
Mind-blowing. I like it.
It's really what makes React so efficient and so enjoyable to work with.
Okay, so what if things get like more complex?
Right.
What if I have multiple components that need to like share the same state?
Right.
Like imagine a shopping cart. You've got, you need to keep track of all the items in the shopping cart across different parts of the app.
Right. So that brings up a really common challenge in larger React applications.
Okay.
Which is managing state that needs to be accessed by a lot of different components.
Right.
And you can imagine if you're just passing props down through layers and layers of components, it gets messy really fast.
Yeah, it'd be this huge, like, tangled web of props flying all over the place.
So that's where we might turn to other tools and patterns for state management.
Okay.
So one popular approach is React's built-in context API.
Context API, okay.
So it's basically like creating a global pool of data that any component can tap into.
So instead of passing the shopping cart data as props through, like, 10 different components,
right,
I could just, like, make it globally available through this context thing.
Exactly, yeah.
Interesting.
And then there's also external libraries like Redux, which offer even more powerful and structured ways to manage that global state.
Wow, so there's like a whole, there's a whole ecosystem for handling state as our app grows. That's really cool.
Exactly.
Okay, so before we get too lost in the state management forest, let's go back to something we touched on earlier, which was event handling.
Right.
So how do we actually make those buttons and other elements do something when a user interacts with them?
Yeah, so event handling is all about capturing those user interactions.
Right.
So things like clicks, hovers, form submissions, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then triggering actions in your React components.
Gotcha.
And the great thing is, it's pretty intuitive.
Yeah.
Similar to how you would handle events in just plain old HTML.
Right.
But with some React-specific conventions.
Okay, so if I want that button
to
update the count in our counter,
right,
I would attach an event handler to that button that calls our update function from useState.
You got it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and typically you'd pass that event handler function as a prop to the button component.
Oh.
Which keeps things nice and organized,
right,
promotes reusability, and it ensures your components are kind of like self-contained units.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
Yeah.
We're building these reusable components, we're managing their internal data with state, we're passing information between them with props,
right,
we're handling events to make them interactive.
Got it.
I'm feeling like a React pro already.
You're well on your way.
This is awesome.
It's fascinating to see how, even with these few concepts, we can build these really dynamic and interactive web applications.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
But I can't help but wonder, as we start building more complex React applications,
right,
what are some of the potential pitfalls or things to watch out for?
Yeah, that's a great question.
As we've been, going through all these React concepts, I've been thinking about how it's not just changing the way we write code,
right,
but it feels like it's shifting the whole landscape of web development.
Yeah, I think you're totally right.
Yeah.
React's impact goes way beyond just being another JavaScript library.
Right.
I think it's really changed the game when it comes to how we think about building user interfaces these days.
So how, give me the big picture.
Okay, well, take this whole concept of component-based architecture.
Right.
Which, It's not unique to React.
Right.
But React has definitely like popularized it.
Yeah.
And now you see it everywhere, like other frameworks, libraries, even design systems are kind of embracing this idea of breaking down interfaces into these reusable building blocks.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Especially as web apps are becoming more and more complex and there's so much going on.
It just makes development so much more organized and efficient and scalable.
Yeah.
Teams can work on individual components independently.
Right.
And then it's so much easier to maintain and update these like self-contained pieces.
Makes a ton of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what about that shift towards declarative programming?
Yeah.
I mean, it still feels a little bit magical to me, I think.
Right.
But I'm starting to see how much it simplifies things.
It is, I think, a really powerful way to think about UI development.
Yeah.
Because essentially you're describing the desired end state of your interface.
Right.
Rather than getting bogged down in how of every single DOM manipulation.
It's almost I don't know, it just feels more intuitive. I don't know, it feels more aligned with how we naturally think about building interfaces.
Exactly. It just frees you up to focus on the logic of your application.
Right.
The user experience, the data flow.
Okay, but let's be real.
Sure.
There's got to be some downsides, right?
Well, one thing is React does have a bit of a learning curve.
Yeah, okay.
Especially for developers who are used to a more traditional imperative way of writing code.
I can imagine that being a hurdle for some people.
Like making that mental shift to thinking in components and props and state management.
Totally.
That can be a bit of a challenge at first.
Yeah.
And like any popular technology.
Right.
The React ecosystem is constantly evolving.
Of course.
But there's always new tools, libraries, patterns popping up.
Yeah.
Which is exciting.
Right.
But also can be a little overwhelming to keep up with.
So it's not just learning, the fundamentals. It's also keeping up with what's new and...
It's part of the fun and it's part of the challenge.
Yeah.
Of working with something that is so vibrant and active.
Gotcha.
But the payoff is huge.
Right.
Because you gain a really powerful set of skills that you can apply to a wide range of projects and platforms.
And speaking of platforms, you mentioned this earlier, React can be used for stuff beyond just web development. Is that right?
Yeah. So, for example, React Native.
React Native
Lets you build native mobile apps using the same principles and concepts.
So the skills are transferable.
It's super versatile.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so as we're wrapping up our deep dive into React, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
Well, I think the most important thing is to understand that React is more than just a library or a framework.
Okay.
It's a way of thinking about front-end development. It's a set of principles that can guide you in building more modular, reusable, maintainable user interfaces. And that is an incredibly valuable skill set to have.
Yeah.
No matter what technologies you end up working with.
Absolutely. Well said. I think this deep dive has really opened my eyes.
I'm glad.
To the power and potential of React.
Yeah.
I mean, we've gone from the basics of components and props to exploring state management, event handling. We even touched on its broader impact on the whole web dev world.
It's been a fascinating journey.
Yeah.
And I encourage all of our listeners to continue exploring.
Yeah.
Experiment, build something cool, and don't be afraid to dive into this ever-evolving world of React.
That's great advice. And for all of you deep divers out there, keep learning, keep building, and who knows, maybe we'll see your amazing React creations out in the wild someday.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Until next time, happy coding.